and I've been hearing this a lot, and I don't know if it is the politically correct, it just is implied to me that they should just take a pan-Asia allocation model. So no country specific, but they'd go to me and go, Alvin, I'd really like to find a really good pan-Asia manager, which is another way of them saying, I really want the China exposure, but I don't want it.
You don't want a headline.
Yeah, I don't want the headline. When you look at its relationships previously with the US and now as it shifts its way, hopefully back a little bit better with Europe, depending on who gets elected this year, but also with the Middle East, how do you feel that's going to transform China's supply chain base and how it builds out its infrastructure?
Yeah.
Is this going to be like an extension of Silk Road, right? Belt and Road Project, which a lot have poo-pooed on as being a failure, but if actually stepping back, looks like it's quite successful in terms of building its infrastructure and its trade relations.
Yeah.
Or will it take a different sort of coat, right? Especially when we look at Saudis, UAE, de-dollarization as a theme as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I think about this is on two fronts. You have obviously the G7-led global order, and then you also have the global south, or essentially the BRICS nation. And what I think is happening right now is it's already clear that the BRICS is forming their own coalition and they are increasingly collaborating with each other.
Yeah.
And within the BRICS, China is essentially the leader in its own right and is expanding to those nations in building out different manufacturing capability, creating diversifying supply chain for all industries. Within the G7, I also think there's actually a bit of a tectonic shift taking place too. If you look at the foreign policy for the US over the past few years, basically since the previous Trump, it's very much governed by protectionism. And if Trump becomes elected again, also added to that, isolationism. So he has already talked about raising tariffs across the board. It's not, China, yes, and then but also against some of its allies.
He just said that he was going to reduce income tax and redeploy that burden directly into tariffs.
Yeah.
So that's not isolationist. I don't know what it is.
And then he also talks about underfunding NATO, because why should we pay for defenses in Europe? And all of that, in my opinion, actually creates an opportunity where China will come into play. So why? So take Europe as an example. I always believe Europe wants US protection, but needs China for its businesses.
Yeah.
If US withdraws or it decreases the protection for Europe, it forces European nations to increase their defensive spending, especially given everything that's happened between Russia and Ukraine, which means they will rely on China even more so for their economy. And so I actually think the current leadership and administration in the US and future administration is actually they are doing more harm than good to themselves by driving other nations. The global south is already there.
Yeah.
I think it's really, even within the G7, to reassess their dependency on the US and see how they can maybe balance that relationship with their development with China.
Do you have a sense of how this might play out? So let me sort of stage it out for you, right? This whole discussion reminds me a lot of Ray his thesis about shifting regimes. And he was actually speaking at a conference here, I think it was the Greenwich conference last week, and he did a video and he talked about how typically these regime changes overlap approximately 25 years. On the assumption, which I think there's a very strong case that we are going through, at least a regime struggle, if not a regime change. Where do you think we are on that curve?
We're still at the early stage, because at the end of the day, the world is still led by the US. The US dollar is still the most held currency around the world, and that itself already kind of put the US on the map, so to speak. But with that said, these things move very quickly, and they can also change overnight. I don't know if you picked up on this, but recently India decided to open a port in Iran. And the US came out and basically said, hey, basically warn India, if you do this, you risk getting sanctioned, because obviously US is also have sanctions on Iran. India basically fired back saying, we're not beholden to the US and we'll do whatever it is that we want. Now that's a very interesting dynamic there, because India obviously plays a critical role in helping US extend their influence in Asia, especially as a counterbalance to China. And now it seems like US has put themselves in a situation where what you're going to do?
Yeah.
India, by definition, is an ally, of the US.
Yep.
Are you really going to sanction India?
Yep.
Because if you do that, well, other nations are also watching, especially European nations. They are also allies of the US. So what is happening here? If they're not going to do something, then why say the threats that you have set?
Okay, so devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
It's not the first time that the U.S. has been faced with the prospects of sanctioning an ally. So you take Japan in the 80s. I believe it was either Hitachi or Toshiba. One of them was caught supplying and doing business with Iran as well. And they were immediately sanctioned by the U.S., after which, because of fear of getting into this type of trade situation, they had to publicly apologize on the front page of every newspaper, as well as dolly up a big fine and face sanctions still, though on a reduced level.
Yeah.
So it's happened before. There's nothing stopping the U.S. from doing it again.
Yeah, but I do think that calculus is a bit different because right now, honestly, I think the biggest concern for the U.S. is still China and how to essentially contain it.
Right.
It requires the help of its surrounding nations, be it in Japan. The biggest one would be India. First is Japan at that time. Actually, Japan was the dominant economy in Asia. In fact, if you look at GDP per capita in Japan in 1990, it's actually higher than that of the US.
Exactly.
So I think the calculus was quite different in the sense that, back then the sanctioning was just the start of a long process of basically bringing down Japan as the sort of the major economy that can compete head to head.
It was the challenger.
It was a challenger.
That was perhaps the most recent incumbent for regime change was in the 80s, was Japan. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Versus today, China's kind of already there. People say it's rising, it's a challenger. I actually look at it as it's already challenging.
I agree. It's already
It's already there.
Yeah.
So it requires the help of others to essentially really bring it back down. But right now, it seems like other nations are not really playing ball because they are also realizing, look, it may not work the way that it did with Japan. US may not be successful in doing this. And then, frankly speaking, most countries in Asia need the Chinese economy.
Yeah.
Japan is just a small nation, versus that of China.
Yeah.
China probably has 14 times more people than the whole Japan has.
I think it's interesting you mentioned India as a counterpoint. A lot of investors, or at least a lot of politically motivated investors, are looking at India as counterweight on the other side. In fact, it's going to be larger. I think it's already larger in population size than China, and it's still at an earlier stage of the S curve.
Correct.
And so you have two thoughts. One is the political system is not centralized or is not controlled enough to exert the type of structural change required to compete with the efficiency that China has, which has its merits.
Yep.
But then you have another school of thought, which is liquidity driven. You pump enough liquidity into an economy, you pump enough capital into it through beneficial trade terms, through bilateral relations, similar to what you're seeing now in the ABC trade, the anything but China trade.
Yeah.
Japan, Korea are all massively benefiting from the offshoring liquidity from China into these external regions, and so is India. So what are your thoughts there, in terms of, number one, how China can compete against this liquidity driven competition? And number two, do you believe that India is a strong counterpoint, and is it worth a thought?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Ruben. And I'll share with you actually what I just had a conversation with a US-based investor over the weekend.
Right.
They called me and was, we were chit-chatting about the market dynamics. And so the story that India is the next China, and it's rising, it's investing in infrastructure and so on and so forth, frankly speaking, has been around for a very long time. And in fact, all else being equal, India has been an open economy much earlier than China has been. Yet India has never really quite made anything out of it until more recently. But that is more of a spillover effect because, like you said, a lot of the capital that were in China got spilled over to other places.
The ABC trade.
Yeah. So from this investor's perspective, when they're thinking about emerging market, India is really secondary to China. In fact, the problem with India, liquidity is still an issue, especially for global large allocators. But if you look at the large cap in the Indian equity space, it's just fine. It's trading. It's not an issue. But once you go down to the mid cap or even the small cap, liquidity dries up.
Okay, so devil's advocate.
Yeah.
This was the case with Hong Kong a long time ago as well, but it grew in liquidity, markets got deeper. India recently in the last year has overtaken Hong Kong in terms of market depth and turnover and volume. So who's to say that it's not moving in the right direction?
Exactly. But this comes down to whether or not you believe that this is a permanent shift. This spillover from China is a permanent thing.
Got it.
From this investor, they feel like it's not permanent. Where if China does come back, a lot of the liquidity is going to sucked up. And from their allocation perspective, they can't deploy hundreds of millions of dollars into the Indian market because they'll just be all concentrated in the large cap anyway.
Right.
By doing that, they just buying ETF. They don't need to have a dedicated strategy investing in that space. Now, family offices are very different. They're smaller pool, a little bit more opportunistic, and there are a lot of alpha to be had in the small and mid-cap space in India.
Yeah.
But for these big allocators, which drives bulk of the liquidity in the market,
Talking billions on billions of dollars. I mean, especially the larger institutional funds.
exactly, they're finding it difficult to underwrite that India story.
In the long term, too. So they have to take like a 10, 15, 20 year view.
Exactly. So what they are now doing is basically reassessing the need to allocate even to emerging market. Because obviously China, from their perspective, and this is mind you, is a US-based investor, so there's a lot of geopolitical concerns, and China is just too much of a risk. They are already divested from China. Well, if you divest China away from
Who's left?
What's left? Really?
LatAm, Europe, right? Japan. Yeah, well, Japan's not. Well, who else is there? Korea, maybe?
Yeah.
ASEAN.
Yeah.
ASEAN's not deep enough.
Exactly.
Korea is Japan 2.0.
Exactly.
Outperforming nevertheless, but still too shallow as a market.
And is it worth the headache, essentially? Especially when if you invest in a global strategy, that global strategy will inevitably have some allocation anyway to some of these places. And, they get the minimum exposure. They don't have to worry about, constantly monitoring, constantly having calls with on-the-ground teams and really try to understand the situation, which is just too much of a hassle.
It seems to me the politically correct move, and I've been hearing this a lot, and I don't know if it is the politically correct, it just is implied to me, that they should just take a pan-Asia allocation model. So no country specific, but they'd go to me and go, Alvin, I'd really like to find a really good pan-Asia manager, which is another way of them saying, I really want the China exposure, but I don't want it.
You don't want the headline. Yes.
Yeah, I don't want the headline. I don't want to take the headline risk. I want you to take the headline risk.
Yeah. So yes, that is a growing trend. And we have seen that across different investor types, be it family offices, endowment, pension, and foundations, and what have you. However, I do think even with that pan-Asian strategy, I think investors are increasingly asking the manager to put a cap on how much China exposure that they're going to have. Very recently, PAG, a huge player in this region, and they were launching a fund with a target fundraise size of about $9 billion. They ended up raising only $4 billion. Still a lot. Don't get me wrong. I wish we could raise $4 billion into this market. But
I'd love to double my AUM.
Exactly. but why that big gap is actually comes down to the fact that they were very reluctant, and actually they didn't want to put a cap on their China exposure.
Oh, really? So this is actually capacity driven.
Yeah.
It's not investor sentiment driven.
No.
There was enough investors wanting to subscribe, but
they were scared off by the fact that they're unwilling to cap their China exposure.
Wow.
And because of that, they decided, they just can't go ahead. So that, which, I think ties everything we talked about right from the start. The sentiment is still very bearish. Despite the recent rally, you definitely see incremental managers, like portfolio managers, rotating out of India, out of Japan, and deploying back into China because cheap valuation, the relative value is very attractive.
Yes.
But the actual weighting on China is still being kept at the minimal, meaning there really are no new inflows that are coming into this market. It's really just portfolio rebalancing within the existing pie, so to speak.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't know when that will shift, and it's something that obviously affects everybody.